Good morning, everybody. So today I'm going to tell you my story of the journey I've had from being a CTO of a bootstrap startup and taking the company to 280 staff through an IPO and an acquisition. A CTO Odyssey, if you will, or as I prefer to call it, the CTO eras. So through desperate Taylor Swift references, I'm hoping to paint a picture of how a CTO role evolves over time. I'm going to try and highlight some lessons that I've learned and also some common pitfalls that hopefully you can avoid. So I'm hoping that there'll be some strategies and ideas that you can take away today, regardless of what era you're currently on. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. This is based on my journey alone. I've done some research study into the journeys of other CTOs, and I've only done this once. I've only been a founding CTO once, but I do have 15 years of experience to draw on, so hopefully there'll be enough useful material here to go by. So who am I anyway? Who's this guy? So my name's Olly Headey, and just a quick career history. It's quite simple. After a mediocre career as a software engineer back in the Jurassic era of the last millennium, I started a company called FreeAgent back in 2007 with two other guys, and we grew that business through an IPO in 2016, and then a trade sale to NatWest in 2018. And I left in 2022 and then joined a company called 37 Signals, the makers of Basecamp and Hey, and I was their director of engineering for just over a year. I wasn't the CTO there. They already have one of those. You may have heard of him. He may appear in this talk. So going back to 2007, when we founded FreeAgent, SaaS was kind of in its infancy, I suppose. Things were a lot simpler back then. Looked like this, maybe. This is FreeAgent before anyone saw it. And things in this era were very blue, green, and yellow. This is FreeAgent's website, 2007. And here's FreshBooks, very blue, green, and yellow. I'm not sure that was a coincidence. And Basecamp, the SaaS OG, very blue, green, and yellow. Also, get projects done. There's like 3-word slogans were popular back then as well. So this was an era when there was no GitHub, no Zendesk. AWS only really kind of started to exist. And most people hadn't heard of the cloud, and if they had, they didn't really understand it, I suppose, let alone trust it. And social media hadn't yet gone toxic. And this is, I guess, at some level, it's kind of like the golden age of SaaS, the golden days, and it's where the story starts. So without further ado, we'll crack on onto our first era, the IC, the individual contributor. And this is, another day, waking up alone, and you're on your own, and you're coding like there's no tomorrow. This is, a great time. You're a CTO in title, but actually you're an engineer or a technical director, as I was briefly before we Americanized ourselves. But practically speaking, you're an engineer, and you're doing your own thing. You're getting to choose the path that you go down, and this is great. And it kind of looks like this. In your dreams, actually looks like this. It's like Instagram reality. This is my desk in a photographer's studio in Walworth, literally just down the road at Elephant Castle, actually. But it was okay. It was good to have all the requirements, text editor, Mac, Yorkshire tea. And at this stage, you're coding like there's no tomorrow. You're doing the technical hard graft, I suppose. But what's really crucial at this stage is that you start to understand the business domain and start to do a deep dive in whatever industry you're in. For us, that was accounting. Maybe it's advertising. Maybe it's crypto. Whatever it is. And it's really important that you develop that underlying knowledge. Go on a bit of a learning journey. And for us, it was accounting. We didn't know anything about accounting. So we had to kind of understand what double entry accounting is, what's VAT, why do we have that, and so on. And books give you a good grounding. That's really good. But you can also, use whatever else you can find. Studying existing work, we were influenced by, for example, Martin Fowler's Pans for Accounting. That helped us build our kind of accounting engine back in the day. So this domain knowledge, as engineers and as practitioners, architects, we want to practice domain-driven design, or at least I do. And you can only really do that if you have this deep understanding of the business domain. So that's really important. And of course, you can get ChatGPT to do this for you and chuck out domains. It might be pretty good, I don't know, but you still need to really understand what's going on there, and you need to be able to validate it, because you might not be able to actually trust it. And so you are a solo dev at this time, but you're also the technical big cheese, the chief engineer, and you need to think in this way, and you need to start adopting that mindset because you need to be mindful of the impact of that. Because whether you know it or not, you are laying the technical foundations of the business, that might be obvious, but you're also creating technical standards and conventions that your future team is going to be following in the future. And you're also at some level deciding on the dev culture of the business, how we work. Even at this early stage, you need to be mindful of that and start on the front foot. And you are going to be making lots of technical decisions, of course. And maybe in the SaaS, one of the biggest things you're going to be doing is deciding on your core stack, your web stack, and the foundation of your product. For us, back in 2007, that was Ruby on Rails. It was kind of hot back then, and we were really cool, so we did Rails. Maybe not so hot these days, still around. If you're anything like the startups I talk to or invest in, it's going to be something like this, to be honest. It's going to be React on the front end, maybe Node on the back end, maybe Python, maybe Go, whatever. And perhaps you will need some specific technology because maybe you need high performance or something, or maybe you're doing data analysis, machine learning, and you need to go down a particular route. But generally speaking, in SaaS, I've found it doesn't matter. What matters is working, reliable, well-tested software and delivering that at speed. And if that's PHP, brilliant. If that's React, Node, fantastic. If it's Rails, even better. And of course, successful SaaS products have been built in every technology. I mean, this is just Rails, GitHub, Shopify, FreeAgent. But you could replace Rails here with PHP, with Node, and still have a really esteemed list of SaaS businesses that are built on there. It really doesn't matter. I think what does matter is that you wear comfortable shoes, because it's a really long road. And what I mean by that is do what you're best at and what you're most comfortable with. Because technology choices generally don't sink SaaS companies. What usually sinks SaaS companies is lack of product market fit or distribution, not the technology. And customers couldn't care less whether you were built in Rails or Node or Python or PHP and jQuery. It doesn't matter. And of course, lots of technical people, they're going to tell you that your choice is bad, it doesn't scale, whatever, but like ignore them, right? The haters are going to hate. You just have to do your own thing. Wear comfortable shoes. And also, keep it simple. Stating the obvious, probably, a bit of a cliche maybe. But working reliable software delivered at speed is what's important. So keep it simple. But if some wild-ass AWS reference architecture allows you to do that, fantastic. But at the same time, a single server or Heroku or whatever gets you a long way. This is like FreeAgent for the first couple of 2 or 3 years, 1,000 customers, whatever. And you might think, well, Ollie, yeah, that's great. Back in 2007, that's what it was like, wasn't it? But my old boss agrees today. He said this the other day, if you're not doing over $1 million in ARR for your SaaS, you almost certainly don't need more than a single server. Chasing 4 nines uptime in those early days by prematurely optimizing your resilience, it's a vast effort that could have fueled features and bug fixes. But basically what he's saying is like you need to optimize for shipping. And I think in this era of the CTO, that's really, really important. In fact, through all the eras. And don't change that mindset. And so we're going to move into the second era now, which is the manager, where you're the man. This is where you leave dev solitude and you start to build a team and you become the boss. And if you're anything like I was in 2010, then you have no idea what you're doing. 2010 memes are the best memes, by the way. So how do you learn this? How do you move and make this transition from being an IC to being a manager? Now, of course, it's a very big topic, but you need to educate yourself. Like most things, management is a learned skill, so you need to learn the ropes. And you can draw inspiration, of course, from previous bosses that you had that were really good, and you can kind of follow their traits, or you can avoid traits of perhaps bad bosses that you've had. And it's not just your own experience that you can draw, and you can also educate yourself with literature. There's a wealth of riches these days, not much more than there was back in 2007, for example, like Camille Fournier's The Manager's Path. My favorite, An Elegant Puzzle by Will Larson. This is really good, and also his blog. Or Managing Humans by Michael Lopp, better known as Rands. It's a good one. And also Radical Candor by Kim Scott, which is all about giving and receiving feedback, high care, high challenge, and the perils of ruinous empathy. It's a good read. But like anything, getting good at something is all about practice. So it's about practicing, educating yourself, practice, get feedback, practice and get feedback. But before we can flex these management muscles, you need to hire people. So you have to wear a new hat, your hiring manager hat. Because in SaaS, generally speaking, of course, when you raise money, have a lot of money, most of that money is going to get spent on the technology side. And a large chunk of that is going to go on people. And people are expensive, both in money terms and also in time. And this is a big challenge. So you need to spend your money wisely. And what I would recommend for when you're building a company, going through the management era, you need to run the entire process of hiring yourself. Literally writing the job specs, reviewing the CVs, the whole thing. And maybe do this for the first 20 hires or so. And the reason I say this is because you're building the company and the culture by doing this. So it's really important to be all over it and to make sure you can drive that. Don't outsource this particular problem. Be all over it. And as you start to hire people, your focus changes from being the IC to being training and coaching, to being that coach. Because you want to kind of effectively indoctrinate your new hires into the culture, your ways of working. You want them to kind of think like you as you've been building the product and give them agency as well. And this is a challenge because you've been coding for so long, but you can still do a bit of that, of course, but you do need to get off the critical path. You're going to be a blocker way sooner than you think. And this is a bit of a shock after you've been pounding the keyboard for months or years in my case. And I didn't do this. I messed up here. This is what I thought it was going to be like when we were hiring engineers. My programming output was going to go on a nice little, nice ramp downwards as we hired more and more engineers. But I was kidding myself. The brutal truth is that there's this treacherous dropping output as you hire more engineers, and it keeps going on downwards the more you hire people. And this is a bit of a shock, but you just have to accept this is the way it is, because your job now is to train and coach your new staff that you've got working for you. That's where the value is here. And you can go all cold, dead hands about it, but don't do this. Try and hang on to shipping those features because only I can do it. Only I can do it now. I just know everything. But don't do that. It's not productive for you or the business, so you kind of need to let that go. You'll survive. And as you're building your team, you're doing a lot yourself, and at some point, it's going to be too much. You're going to need to spread the load. So you're going to need to hire a manager, right? So when do you do that? Well, what you don't do is wait until you have about 16 engineers reporting to you, which is what I did. That's not really a good idea generally. It doesn't work out too well. But generally speaking, I think when you're around 8 to 10 developers, you need a bit of a plan. How are you going to do this? And part of that is figuring out which route you're going to go on. Are you going to be hiring dedicated managers, or are you going to be asking some devs to take on management duties and take on more of a player manager role, so to speak? And definitely here be dragons here. There's no right or wrong answer. But what I would say is you need to be really clear on what that role actually means at that stage of your business. What does an engineering manager actually do for a team with 8 to 10 people? Can you be clear enough? Is there enough stuff for them to do? And if you're going to ask your ICs to do some of this, what exactly are you going to ask them to do specifically, and how are you going to get them there? We were doing this at 37 Signals a couple of years ago, and my boss had an interesting point, and he said, I understand why we need a manager, but what will they do for the other 60% of the week? And I thought it's a good point, right? And especially in a small team, in a small growing company, you need to kind of be careful. You need to be very clear on what that role entails, because what you don't really want is someone creating work for themselves, busy work, because that's not very productive. But at the same time, you don't want to be saddling your most productive devs with management duties all day and every day. So it's very difficult. We tried both at FreeAgent. I think at this stage in a company's evolution, I would err towards the player manager, as long as you're willing to train and coach the people in that job and take a lot off their hands. But it's a tricky one. And so as you're onboarding your team, you need to establish how you work. What are your rituals? What's kind of the cadence, your heartbeat? How's that going to work? And this stuff, this is hard to change, but you need to keep it simple. And I think there's a temptation generally to kind of apply, I don't know what that dog's doing, but you might want to apply best practice, agile, stand-ups, retros, and all of this. But I would say first take a step back and ask yourself why. Why are you doing that? What is it you're trying to accomplish? And are they actually helpful, because remember, you need to optimize for shipping, and this is crucial now and in the future. So what's the minimum that you need to know from your team day in, day out? At 37 Signals, we asked 2 questions of everyone. Every Monday, we would ask, what are you working on this week? And people would write down, here are my objectives, this is what I'm trying to achieve, here's what I'm going to ship. And at the end of every day, we asked, what did you work on today? And that would be, they would explain, here's what I've done, maybe some demos of what they've produced, what product they've produced. And this is super effective. It's all asynchronous, didn't interrupt people, and it provided this really useful record of how things are progressing in the business, certainly in the engineering team. And of course, you don't need to use Basecamp for this. You could use Slack, Geekbot, there are other tools that do that. But the crucial thing is that you need to figure out a way to get this information without getting in the way. And I think it's the same for the dev process. There's a temptation to do planning meetings, planning poker, story points, and all the rest of it. But here's a quote from Ron Jeffries, who's invented XP. He said this a few years ago. I'd like to say I may have invented story points, and if I did, I'm sorry now. Because we have to understand why we want to do this. What are we trying to accomplish, and what are we trying to get out of our processes? Disrupting developers when we want to optimize for shipping can be a real problem. As Jason Fried says, 5 people in a room for an hour isn't a 1-hour meeting, it's a 5-hour meeting. And this is a really good point. There's hidden costs here. And at this stage, I would advise reducing overhead of meetings and all the rest of it, because you have to optimize for shipping and get out of people's way, allowing them to do deep, uninterrupted work. That's what works. And you can look at other things 37 Signals shape up, and I don't mean you have to follow this methodology, but what's really interesting, I think, in this approach is the concept of fixed time variable scope. So rather than going to engineers and saying, well, how long is this feature going to take? Instead, you flip it on its head and say, hey, look, we've got an appetite for 3 weeks to develop this feature. How are we going to ship that? What can we cut? How can we simplify it in order to get that value in front of our customers in that time? I think this is really powerful, but people don't really adopt it as much. And it's a challenge, but it's something to really look into. And so you've navigated the management Cs. Hopefully you've got a happy team, simple but effective processes in place. But now there are more and more demands on your team and you, and so you need to scale. And it's not just one scaling job, there's multiple. You have to scale yourself, you have to scale your product, and you have to scale your team. And this is a challenging time, I think, in a company. There's a lot of whitewater, it's quite chaotic, can get a bit of a mess, no doubt. You're probably going to wear a t-shirt, something like this. It's kind of what I had to do. But let's talk about scaling yourself. So when you're doing fundraising rounds, you've got cash coming into the business. The temptation is to hire loads of people. But before you do that, you do need to step back and scale yourself, or you're just going to drown in all the stuff to do. And what I mean by that, it's about understanding your bottlenecks, what you're actually doing versus what you should be doing. And if you're in the weeds and you're kind of doing code reviews or signing off production releases, you're a bottleneck. If you're still doing all the hiring at this stage, all of yourself, then you're a bottleneck. And so you need to spread the load. And you do that by delegating. And just a quick word on delegating. It's not this binary thing. It's a multi-level thing. There's a really good article here, 7 levels of delegation, that I would recommend. And it's all about creating clarity, because when you're delegating at one end of the scale, you're either just telling someone exactly what to do, and at the other end of the scale, you're giving full autonomy, saying, listen, this just needs to get done, just go and do it, I don't care how. But generally speaking, the delegation is somewhere in between. And it really helps to figure out, when you are delegating, at what level you're doing that and making that clear to the person you're delegating to manage expectations between you. It's really, really important. I would highly recommend working on that. And I think also scaling your network is something that's really useful to do. It can be lonely at the top. CTOs are more than happy to help other CTOs. And so there are networks these days like Bartech, which are really good, where you can solicit advice from people who are in the same boat. Maybe they've done things that you're trying to do. Or CTO Craft's another one, very good. Or even private WhatsApp groups. These seem to be quite popular these days. Just basically anywhere where people are hanging out willing to help you, because it's a learning journey. And if you have If you're VC backed, there's a good chance that your investors are going to have some sort of back network. FreeAgent was in the 0.9 family, and they had this great Slack with different channels for different areas where you could go and share ideas. They would set up one-to-ones with random people. And they also did CTO meetups, founder meetups, and so on. It's just great for connecting and getting advice from other people as you're going through your kind of journey, especially in the scaling era. Also LinkedIn, of course. Connect to as many useful people as you can on LinkedIn. Don't be shy. This can be really, you never know when someone might be able to help you, so I'd really recommend this. People are generally always want to connect. And then you need to scale your product. Customer growth is increasing, your team's growing, there's more demands on the product, and you need to make sure you can cope with demands. And this can be daunting, and generally in situations like this, the first thing you do is don't panic. Of course, good advice. Unless you're on Vercel untapped billing, then of course you absolutely should panic, because this stuff is wild, man. But you're a business-to-business SaaS. It's highly unlikely you're going to go viral, right? But scaling something that bothered me back in the day, I think it's to do with this. We had the Twitter fail whale, and Twitter used Rails on the front end, right? That means Twitter can't scale, so Rails can't scale. FreeAgent used Rails. Oh my God, we can't scale. So this used to give me panic attacks. Especially around the database. I was always worried about, when are we going to need to shard this database? How am I going to do that? I don't even know how to do it. I don't even know what that is. But looking back, I probably needn't have really worried, I don't think. Because computers are fast, and they keep getting faster all the time. FreeAgent these days, I'm not there, but it has around 200,000 customers, hammering the app day in, day out, really busy. And it's a Rails monolith with one primary database server. Basecamp, even more high traffic, I think thousands of requests a second at peak. It's a single monolithic Rails app with a single primary database. And of course, there was a lot of query optimization going on, adding read replicas, caching strategies, but that's just kind of normal, right? We never had to shard the database, never had to rewrite everything in Rust microservices. And sure, at some point there's going to be a tipping point. Maybe it's 1 million customers, maybe it's 2 million, whatever. But how likely is that in SaaS, B2B SaaS? Maybe, and even if it does happen, isn't that a nice problem to have? I'll take it. 1 million customers, I can hire people to help me solve this stuff, right? And to kind of drill the point home, there's this great article by Tristan Hume where he kind of postulates, can you run production Twitter on a single machine in 2023? And he goes into great detail about this and kind of concludes, well, yeah, kind of. Because computers are really fast, and they're getting faster all the time. And that's not to say you can't ignore resilience and redundancy. Of course not. You need to invest a lot of time into this. If you don't have a well-tested, solid disaster recovery process that you are testing in production, actually testing in production for real, then you need to sort that out, as well as testing the kind of integrity of your backups, really important. Because one thing's for sure, the shit will hit the fan at some point, so you need to be prepared. Work on that. So as well as scaling your product, you need to scale your team, and this is possibly your biggest challenge. Not just the hiring and the training and the onboarding, but also the arranging, how are we going to structure these teams? How are we going to get them working together? And this is a big talk in itself, I think, again, but there's one specific pitfall that I'm going to talk about, and that's team size and catastrophe theory. And by catastrophe theory, I mean where there's an abrupt change in an output in response to only a really small change in an input, like an inflection point. And I've stolen this idea, by the way, from Mark Logan, so full credit to him. And so this is when you're hiring people, this is what you think is going to happen. You're going to hire more employees, and your outcomes are going to get better and better. But the reality is actually like this. Things are going to improve, and then when you get to around 50 people, productivity and outcomes are going to plateau, and if you don't do anything, then it's going to fall off a bit of a cliff there. And it's not just once this happens multiple times in the lifetime of a company. 50 people, and then probably again at 100 people, and then again at 200 people, and we saw this happen at FreeAgent. So the question is, what do you do about this, and how do you clear these inflection points, and why do they happen? And so as Mark Logan says, to clear an inflection point, you must be prepared to change almost everything about how your organization fundamentally works. And that's because the inflection point was caused by almost everything to do with how your organization currently works. So you can't stand still. You have to rethink, you have to evolve, change your processes and your structures. You can't just throw the people at the problem. as Fred Brooks says, what one programmer can do in 1 month, 2 programmers can do in 2 months. And this is true, but you can overcome this. And so you do need to hire people. But I have this big thing where it's like, you should stop hiring too many people. There's a big temptation when you do a big fundraising round, and you can figure out, well, how many people can I hire for this much money? And off you go hiring. You go shopping with this big wad of cash. But that's generally a bad idea in my experience. And it's not just me that thinks that. Mark Andreessen, big VC guy, he says the same thing. He says the good big companies are overstaffed by 2x. The bad big companies are overstaffed by 4x or more. And he should know. So stop hiring too many people. So my advice is beware of these inflection points. They are going to happen. And when they do, you need to reinvent your processes and your team structures. You do need to hire people, of course, but only when it hurts, by which I mean when you absolutely know there's a specific role that you're trying to fill. Only then should you hire for that role. Don't just hire people and try and find stuff for them to do. That generally doesn't really work too well. And if you can, and this is not easy, right? But like higher quality, not quantity, by which I mean the more productive people you can hire, the better. It's better to have 10 really fantastic, highly productive people than like 20 mediocre ones. But not easy. It does involve maybe raising the bar in what you spend and so on. And sometimes, when things are running really, really well, humming along just nicely, that's fine, leave it. As Warren Buffett says, the trick is when there's nothing to do nothing. So don't scale prematurely. And so we're on to our fourth era, the exec. And this is generally after the first inflection point that we've just seen, where you're transitioning from being a manager to being a leader. And you're going to have a bunch of new exec peers, CTO, of course, CSO, CFO, CMO, all the Cs. And this is now your first team. Engineering is no longer your first team. The execs are your first team. You still represent engineering, of course, but the execs are your first team. And the job now is to work together to build cohesion within that team. And this is really crucial. And there are these 2 essential guides, I would say, to high-performing exec teams by Patrick Lencioni. They were a bit of a game changer at FreeAgent, especially the advantage. And the hypothesis in the advantage is that the single greatest advantage any company can achieve is organizational health. Yet it's ignored by most leaders, even though it's simple, free, and available to anyone who wants it. So cohesive teams with strong organizational health perform better. But ultimately, this is about building trust in your exec team, which is not straightforward. This is really hard, right? You have to be vulnerable with each other, and it takes time and effort. But the kind of things you'll have to do is obviously talking to your peers, scheduling one-to-ones, building that trust and knowledge, understanding how they work, what's important to them. You have to go on a learning journey, just like you did back in the IC era, learning about the business domain. Now you have to be learning about the different departments of your peers, finance, marketing, reading books. You also need to listen to what makes them tick, what's going on in their departments, how do they perceive engineering. That's really important. And also, crucially, you need to represent your exec peers as well in difficult conversations. There's going to be a time when some engineers like pounding on marketing about something, but you can't just start pounding on marketing as well. You have to take the other side and explain to the engineers why that's important to marketing and why it's important to the business. You're going to have a budget. You're going to have a CFO. They're going to build a financial model, and it's going to have a big impact on you as a CTO and on the business. They're going to give you a budget, and you're going to have to start working with that. You're going to get spreadsheet overload. You're going to learn the horrors of SaaS subscriptions and how much you're spending, and you're probably going to have to tighten the purse strings, which is quite difficult. This makes some difficult decisions. Because a lot of this exec era is about compromise. And like in tech, it's about making trade-offs. You don't really have carte blanche to do what you want anymore. You can maybe call some technical shots, but generally in the business and prioritization, you've now got to work with your execs. So for example, maybe marketing want to do a launch on a Friday afternoon, and it requires deploying your software or something. You can't just veto that and say, absolutely not, we don't do that. Maybe you can. But what you should be doing is listening to marketing. Why do they need that? How can you work together to get that thing to happen? It's really important. And that's where, because you're building this trust and cohesion within your team. And another C word, compliance. As you get bigger investors, maybe bigger enterprise clients, you as CTO, you're going to be under the hammer for due diligence. You're going to get questionnaires. You're going to have to do interviews, open source audits, all of this good stuff. You'll be staring at spreadsheets like this in horror. You'll be like asking yourself, how did it come to this? How did my life come to this? But it's okay. This is just normal, right? And you can hire people to help you do this. You can delegate. You don't have to do it all yourself. It doesn't have to all fall on you. You can even get AIs to do it, apparently. So a lot of this exec era is around formalization, formalizing processes. And it's a far cry from being an IC or indeed from being a manager. Because with your new execs, there's going to become jobs like this. HR will want expense policies, working from home policies, attendance tracking, and performance reviews. Finance, we talked about budgets, but also procurement processes, IT audits, fun stuff like that. And in security, the world of GDPR compliance, maybe like ISO stuff, incident response, pen tests. And even at a leadership level, you're going to have like OKR meetings, all hands offsites. All of this stuff's happening. There's a lot going on. Also KPIs. Speaking of which, briefly, I think KPIs are not used enough. They're really powerful when used right. And the idea here is where between you as execs, each department will build a series of key performance indicators of what's important to the business in that area. So in technology, that might be like response time, security issues, whatever. But by agreeing this at the exec level, you define these thresholds. When things dip below the thresholds into the red, you have the mandate to just go and fix stuff. You don't have to go and ask permission or have some big committee meeting to decide that. That's the power of KPI. So I really recommend kind of delving into that. Might make a good session today. And all of this process change, there's a lot going on. It's a lot to juggle. But it's really important that you keep track of what's going on in engineering, despite all the other stuff that's being asked of you. Hopefully, your team is built with strong foundations, and they can get on just well without you being there all the time. But you do need to stay informed, passively and proactively, and that goes back to how we did that and tracking what people are working on and how they're doing. And it also means building a strong engineering leadership team as well underneath you and training them to be cohesive and building trust in that as well, which is really important. So you have to keep your eye on the ball. And so we're going to move into our final era, the strategist. And this is an era where you're probably over 100 people and your role moves from being the operator to being fully strategic. You're fully out of the weeds, basically. And your job at this stage is to start creating clarity about the path you're on, where you are right now as an engineering organization and where you're going. But I suppose you need to know what even is strategy? What is that word that people use? Well, I would say there's probably one book that you need to read on strategy, which is this book. It's a very good book, where he distills strategy down to something like this, where a good strategy identifies a critical problem and diagnoses a root cause to that problem, and then designs a coherent approach to solving it, and ultimately provides clarity, where a bad strategy is the opposite, lacks substance, uses buzzwords, fluff, vague goals. There's no plan, and it doesn't actually address the issue. So how do you actually apply this in practice? What does that actually look like? Well, what we did at FreeAgent is in the technology, engineering was kind of technology as a broader name. We broke it down into 4 different areas. Security, because security was like number 1 for customers' data. Productivity, because we want to optimize for shipping, we want to get stuff done. Reliability, because we want FreeAgent to be available at any time of the day when customers want to use it. We also want it to be correct. It's an accounting product. And also scalability. We want to be able to cope with more demand. And for each of these pillars, we kind of broke it down into different areas. And for each of those, it would be like, here's where we are now, and here's where we want to get to over the next couple of years or whatever. Because it's all about creating clarity. Good strategy creates clarity. That's the job. So I would recommend developing the strategy and also communicating in a way that is clear and human, and people can understand, not just techies, but everyone else. So this is the job. Create a presentation, and and show that to as many people as you can, because you have to over-communicate this stuff. In The Advantage, Lencioni says, people need to hear something at least 7 times before they begin to believe leaders are serious. And it's really true. You have to over-communicate it. So build a slide deck, show it to every new recruit in the business, present it regularly in town halls, to your exec team, to the board, whatever, because you have to keep over-communicating this stuff. And also you'll find at this stage a strategic CTO becomes risk-driven, driven by risk, not features. So at some point, probably in the exec era, you'll have created a risk register, which have lots of operational risks that you're responsible for. And this is actually really useful. And you can start to use this to guide priority. If someone says, shall we refactor this billing system? The question is really, well, what's the risk of doing it versus not doing it? And if someone says, do we need to fix this GDPR problem now? Then you can ask, well, what's the risk of doing it versus not doing it? And it's a really powerful thing. But all of this formality and all of these processes can really induce kind of death rattle in a company. So you also need to work hard to prevent that. You need to be, what I say is like a culture warrior, to try and create that vibe that has been the success of your business. And this involves documenting company law, why you exist, why you do that. And we created this field guide at FreeAgents as one example of doing this, which is an illustrated book. And it was all about why are we here, what do we do, who are we, why do we exist? And it was really valuable. We also created meaningful values, not the corporate vacuous jargon. I know some people don't like these things, but actual actionable things that you could embody and behave the way you can behave. We also did it in engineering. We created 5 principles for how we approach problem solving in engineering. Keep it simple being one of them. And these are actually really useful. They help you drive decisions, close arguments, and they allow you to kind of give agency to people. Really powerful stuff. I recommend looking at that. And also in this stage of this era, I should say, you might consider hiring a VP of engineering. And this depends, on your kind of strengths and appetite. But we did this at FreeAgent. And I would recommend if you do this, you do it like this, where the VP of engineering and the CTO, you are peers. The VP of engineering shouldn't be a subordinate of the CTO. I don't think that works very well. And the VP of engineering should be responsible for execution, like product delivery, hiring, and whatnot. And the CTO responsible for strategy, like the technical platform, security, IT, all of that kind of stuff. We did this at FreeAgent. It was really, really good. So finally, a word about IPOs and exits. So FreeAgent, as I say, we did an IPO in 2016 on AIM here in London. And this is a big change. So an IPO is like just basically a big fundraising round. It's just got a lot more lawyers. It's more secret, and it's really, really expensive. Really. And this will see a change. Your exec team at this stage is going to change. You're going to have a new board, which is usually the CEO, CFO, and then some non-execs. So as a CTO and the other execs, you have now a level down on the rung. And so you'll find that information doesn't flow quite as easily, and you also become more risk aware. You're a public company now, so the stakes are really high. And it will slow you down. This is quite normal. It's just another compromise. As Zuck learned, you do go for this whole move fast and break things mentality to like a move fast but with stable infra. But it's okay. It's just another compromise, and it's all part of the journey. And at some stage, there's going to be a time when you decide you're going to leave the company, never coming back. You're out of there for good. So if I was going to give you one piece of parting advice, which I think is really important that you can apply at every era of the CTO, from IC all the way through to the strategic, is that's to make yourself disposable. Don't hoard knowledge. You need to kind of transfer that openly, document everything you know, the processes, the way you think. You need to train leaders and just make sure things can happen fine without you. And if you've done a good job here, there should be virtually no impact at all when you go. I'll leave the final words with Seth Godin, who says, a smart founder, or CTO in this case, leaves her company in a moment when it actually does better without her. Thanks very much.